Chapter 2: The Victory Garden. The war had come as a surprise to some, but not to Jeff and my father. Long before our country got into it, the two of them had followed the overseas news. They leaned in toward the radio, elbows on knees, for the evening news with Lowell Thomas, then talked it over at supper. Both Nazi Germany and Japan had fired on U.S. ships at sea, trying to destroy the food we sent to England and China. Our government had said that if Americans planted more home gardens, the crops from large farms could go to help our allies overseas. Mother hoped that would keep our boys out of the war. Boys like Jeff and his friends. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had approved a peacetime military draft, and Jeff was almost old enough to go. So we planted our first garden ever in the spring of 1941, months before Japan plunked us into the war we didn't want. Naturally, old Tom Burt was standing over us, giving advice. The tomatoes were Jeff's idea. He sowed the seeds, small as coarse grains of sand, in boxes made from scrap wood, and set them under the workroom window. The sun shone through the limbs of the mulberry tree, leaving the glass cold but warming the seeds. When the tomato seeds sprouted into plants, Jeff and Dad set them out in the garden. Jeff told the old man, looking over his shoulders, "Just wait till these get ripe, Mr. Burt. They'll be even better than yours." That made old Burt snort. "We'll just see about that." Jeff never did get his ripe tomatoes. The tomatoes in Kansas still had months to go when far out in the Atlantic Ocean, a German U-boat sank an American merchant ship. Jeff didn't wait to turn draft age. He enlisted on a clear June day, shortly after he graduated from Shady Grove High School. I didn't cry until later. We were all brave at the train depot. Jeff hugged us and joked with Dad. "You gotta save my face here, Dad. Make sure those tomatoes beat old Tom Burt's." Well, I didn't give a hoot about tomatoes. What were the tomatoes without Jeff? He had always been there, and now he was gone. I slouched on the back steps, wishing he would come around the corner of the house and call me Squirt. I dreamed of flying down the street on his handlebars, the way I had since before I could tie my shoes. I didn't climb the mulberry tree. I let my library book go overdue. I watched Dad loosen soil with a hoe and bend over to pull out weeds or pick off bugs. But I didn't go help him. The garden had not kept Jeff at home. I wanted nothing to do with it. "I don't see why we have to feed England and China," I burst out at supper one night. Dad knew what I meant. "Jeff always wanted to join up, Teresa. He just left a little early, that's all." But I heard a catch in his voice and saw tears in my mother's eyes. The first letter from Jeff came to all of us, but his second one was just for me. "Guess you'll have to eat my tomatoes while I'm away, Squirt," he wrote. Jeff's tomatoes, not England's, not China's. The next day I sidled up to Dad in the garden. Soon we were watching together for the tiny green beads, no bigger than the ones on Mother's good necklace, to form inside the yellow tomato blossoms. Old Tom Burt needled Dad into a regular duel over those tomatoes. Jeff had thrown down a dare, and Burt wasn't about to let it go. Word got around, and the neighbor ladies with my mother and Mrs. Burt ran blind taste tests. Late that first summer, they pronounced the Marx's tomatoes a little bit better. "Oh, well, a little bit," Bert had sputtered. The Chronicle, our local paper, told it this way: "First-time gardener beats old-timer." Vegetables from the first garden sat on pantry shelves in mason canning jars before our country ever got into the war. And just when our thoughts had started to turn to Christmas that year, Japanese planes bombed an American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. President Roosevelt went on the radio and called it a date which will live in infamy. The United States was now in the war that had already spread across much of the world. Jeff had been gone for 6 months. I took his place at the radio with Dad, listening for news of the war. It didn't go very well for our side for a long time. We damaged some German U-boats in the Atlantic, but it was a different story in the Pacific. Right away, the Kansas City paper screamed a headline: "Japanese gain quick success." Hong Kong fell, then Singapore, and the Solomon Islands came under attack. Dad marked all these places on the map Jeff had made while he was still in school. Roosevelt called for 60,000 airplanes to be built in 1 year. Wouldn't Jeff love that? 60,000. I couldn't imagine 1,000. Tom Burt demanded a rematch when we put in our second garden 4 months after Pearl Harbor in the spring of 42. I guess we showed him. We beat him again. We were heavy into the war by then, already feeling a food shortage that would get worse as the war went on and farm workers left the fields to help build ships and airplanes. A lot of people who had never gardened before began to dig up their yards. Victory gardens sprouted all over our town and every town nationwide. Everyone said the gardens would help to bring the boys home. I tried hard to believe.